Okay, well, I can see we're at 1 minute after the hour, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. My name is Matt Thomas, and thank you for tuning into the USGS Landslide Hazards Program seminar series. For those of you that are new to this meeting, you have the ability to submit questions via the chat window or to use the raise your hand feature in combination with your microphone and video camera. We typically wait until the end of the presentation to take questions, so in the meantime, please just do your best to make sure your microphone and video camera are off when you aren't intending to speak. Erich Peitzsch is a research physical scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. He has worked for the USGS since 2007, studying avalanches, snow, and glaciers. He earned his MS and PhD in Earth Sciences from Montana State University. His current research focuses on avalanche frequency and associated climate processes, wet snow processes, and remote sensing to examine snow depth change. When not studying the cryosphere, he is usually chasing his two sons around the mountain on bikes, skis, or feet. And that sounds like a job in itself. So Erich, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. And yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm gonna share my screen here. And how's that look?
It looks like it's just about to pop up, Erich. There we go. I can see you live now, and just a reminder about your video camera related to your when you do your video. Up to you.
Okay, and I'm also gonna turn off the camera here. Great, yeah, just let me know if anything looks bad. But thanks again, Matt, for the intro, and thanks to all of you for again tuning in on this Wednesday afternoon, or probably afternoon wherever most folks are. All right, let's get started here. So we're going to talk about snow avalanches and how they're a hazard and a driver of landscape change. Excuse me. So first, I want to acknowledge my research team at NOROCK, the Climate Change and Mountain Ecosystems team. And all of these folks have contributed to all of this work that I'll present today in major ways. And without their effort, none of this work is possible. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors on the avalanche climate work from the Northern Rocky Mountain region that I will present today, as well as the USGS Ecosystems Land Change Science Program. All right, let's get into it. So why do we study avalanches? Well, as I mentioned, they are a hazard and they are also a disturbance. So in the Western US, avalanches are the most frequently occurring lethal form of mass movement on an annual basis. They're creating impacts to public safety, commerce, and recreation. Avalanches, they're also a driver of landscape change. You can see on the right here, just an example of some disturbance along a railway in Southern Glacier Park. And this landscape change, it's actually important to flora and fauna and habitat, and how this landscape interacts, or how avalanches interact with other disturbances, such as wildfire, to create new avalanche terrain in areas that were once forested. So avalanche ecology is sort of the side of avalanches that we know not as much about as we do from a hazard perspective. So this is from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, just documenting avalanche fatalities per year from 1950 to 2 seasons, or the winter of 2019 and 20. And this just provides some context that over the last 10 winters, an average of 27 people died in avalanches each winter in the US. So last year, of course, was very tragic with 37 fatalities. And that was due to a number of reasons, including a fairly widespread unstable snowpack throughout the Western US, and potentially even more users in avalanche terrain. So regional US Forest Service avalanche centers and transportation corridor operations, they're doing a fantastic job of forecasting and educating the public, especially considering the increase in the number of people in avalanche terrain over the years. But avalanche research itself at the federal level is fairly limited. Aside from us at NOROCK, the Forest Service National Avalanche Center does some opportunistic research with their adjunct duties, but they're not a research entity. So we've partnered with the National Avalanche Center, the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station for some of the work that I'll present today. And we've also partnered with folks in Southeast Alaska, affiliated with the Alaska Climate Science Center. to do some of the similar work, again, that I'll present up in Southeast Alaska. So the results of this work, the results are used by avalanche forecasters in many operation types, again, including regional backcountry avalanche centers, avalanche forecasters for transportation corridors like the I-70 that goes through Colorado, some of the transportation corridors in California as well, and then here in Montana. It's also used by infrastructure planners and natural resource managers. So the image on the right is shows an avalanche protective structure above a neighborhood, a small neighborhood in Colorado, and this is just outside of Aspen. And the engineer that designed this structure designed it to withstand a 100-year avalanche event. So in March 2019, a widespread avalanche cycle occurred throughout Colorado, and a very large avalanche hit this particular structure. Some of the debris spilled over the dam, just breaking a few windows on the house, and it could have been much, much worse. So we're actually researching the return period of an avalanche of this size and in this location in Conundrum Creek here, if you're familiar with it, in our recent project in Colorado. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that in detail later. So our group focuses on 4 major areas of avalanche research at NOROCK. We study how often large magnitude avalanches occur, and we look at associated climate and atmospheric drivers of those large avalanche events. We also use drones to look at snow depth change in complex avalanche terrain and how that affects both avalanche hazard and snow as a water resource. We collaborate with the National Park Service on an avalanche forecasting program for the annual spring opening of the Going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park in Montana. And then in concert with those forecasting efforts, we also do wet snow avalanche research, particularly or sort of motivated by the potential increases of wet avalanches due to a warming climate. So today I'm going to discuss these 4 areas of research and present some recent results from each. So let's start off talking about avalanche frequency. So our main objective of this component of our research group is to reconstruct avalanche chronologies from the past so that we can examine climate drivers, and this ultimately helps us understand future avalanche behavior. We published some work that we did in the Northern Rockies region, and today I'll present the results of that work. But as I mentioned earlier, we're also currently working in Southeast Alaska and Colorado so that we can compare frequency as well as associated climate drivers in different snow climates. So for example, Colorado is a continental snow climate. It's sort of characterized by shallow snowpack, high elevation, and predominantly cold and dry conditions. While Southeast Alaska is a maritime climate located next to the ocean with much wetter and warmer conditions. So to achieve our objectives in this study, we use Dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings, to reconstruct a long-term magnitude avalanche chronology. And in the Northern Rockies, we were able to reconstruct a chronology from 1867 to 2017. And we define large magnitude as a size 3 or greater on the avalanche destructive size scale. And this scale ranges from 1, which is relatively harmless to humans, to 5, which is the ability to destroy wide swaths of forest and gouge, basically transform the landscape. So a D3 right in the middle there is defined as having the ability to bury or destroy a car, damage a truck, destroy a wood frame house, or break a few trees. And you can see in these images, the one on the right is from Colorado, and you can see the destruction of the forest there from this particular avalanche. And this was from the March 2019 cycle. So if anyone here is from Colorado and may remember that cycle, it was pretty widespread, caused a lot of disruption to transportation corridors as well. The image on the left is from the Going to the Sun Road in Glacier Park, and you can see the heavy machinery, that's a bulldozer and a excavator, removing about 30 feet of combined snow and woody debris from the Going to the Sun Road during spring clearing operations. So how do we do this? So here's a little video. Should work, we tested it out, and I'll just kind of talk us through it. But what we do is we suspect this is an avalanche scar. We'll cut into that tree, just like Adam is doing there with the chainsaw. We'll take out a little cross section from each tree, and then we will sand it so that it has a pretty polished and smooth surface. And we'll take it to the lab. And then in the lab, we basically take these cross sections, look at them under the microscope. And that's where we're able to date the tree. So when a tree is knocked over, we don't necessarily know when it's knocked over. So we don't know when it died. So we can say how old the tree was, but we don't know the exact dates of when the tree started growing and then when it died. So we're able to cross date these trees with live trees. So we take cores from live trees outside of the avalanche path. And that allows us to date those trees so that we can then look at each ring and we know the exact year for each of those rings. And from there, we are able to look at any sort of avalanche signal or disturbance in the tree ring. And I'll get to that in just a sec. And that allows us to date each tree ring. All right. So, as I mentioned, we use, we're using Dendrochronology here. And this sort of method allows for a pretty robust assessment of avalanche frequency across a really large spatial extent. And we use Dendrochronology because observational records of avalanches in many areas really don't date back that far. Colorado, for example, has a pretty good observational record, I'd say from roughly the 1950s or 60s to present, and of course it gets better as we get closer to the present. But excuse me, prior to 1950, it's not really good, and that's actually a pretty long record for the U.S. When I talk to my colleagues in Europe, of course, they look at their observational records, and because they've just sort of lived in the mountains for centuries, they have some pretty darn good observational records that extend into the 1700s or back to the 1700s. So I'm pretty jealous of that. But regardless, one way of getting around it is by using the study of tree rings, and that's what we're doing. So you can see the image in the lower right here. If we were to use only cores, using an increment borer like the image on the bottom left, if we were to just take our increment borer, put it in the tree, and take out a small core, it's about 5 millimeters wide. And in that lower right image, you can see that even if we took a core in all 4 directions on the tree, we could potentially miss some really important information. And you'll see here that it's labeled as a scar from 1933. So if we took our cores and went in those directions, then we potentially would have missed that scar from 1933, and we would have missed the pith, which is the center of the tree, from 1891. So it would have been really hard for us to date, to actually get the full information from this tree. So that's why cross sections are really important. So in one of our papers in Natural Hazards in Earth System Science, we looked at had we used only cores instead of cross sections as well, or predominantly cross sections, then we would have missed about 30% of the years that we identified as major avalanche years in our data set from the Northern Rockies. So yeah, it takes a lot of time. I mean, sure, it's fun to go out and use the chainsaw and collect these data, but it takes a lot of time, especially the processing and the lab work. So. But it's worth it, because otherwise we would have missed a pretty substantial amount of data. All right, so our study site, as I mentioned, is located in the Northern Rockies of Northwest Montana. And we sampled in 4 distinct mountain ranges, you can see here, labeled by the red dots. We call these 4 distinct ranges, or we call them subregions, and they all have similar avalanche climate types. And so this sampling strategy is based on the concept of scale triplet, if you're familiar, but it basically defines the spacing, the extent, and the support of our sampling scheme. So it allows us to understand the nature of the problem or the process, in this case, avalanches. It allows us to understand the scale at which the measurements should be made. And then it also allows us to estimate the measurements across space. So we can take these point measurements and actually estimate them for the general region when we combine all 4 subregions together. So just a little more detail about some of the study sites here. This is the, excuse me, in the southern part of Glacier National Park is John F. Stevens Canyon, and it's a major transportation corridor, US Highway 2, and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway run through this canyon here. And you can see the avalanche path, you can see the road in the bottom of the canyon there, and the railway sort of on, to the looker's right of the road. And then all of the avalanche paths are, of course, the treeless chutes that come down and affect the railway and the road. Some of the railway, some of it has sheds that protect it, but over time, the avalanches have basically extended beyond the sort of planned or expected boundary, and so some of the sheds now come up short, and debris can still reach the railway. On the right is the Going to the Sun Road, and I'll talk more in depth about the road itself and the avalanche paths that affect it. But that's some of the terrain that affects the Going to the Sun Road, the very large avalanche paths there. The road runs right through the valley there. So as I mentioned, we take these samples to the lab and we're looking at them under the microscope. And what are we looking for? So there can be numerous tree ring response types that result from mechanical damage to the tree caused by avalanches. So imagine that there's an avalanche on a slope, or sorry, a tree on a slope, and an avalanche comes down and hits that tree. Then if it doesn't uproot the tree and totally knock it, uproot it and then kill it, then it can potentially leave a signal. So it might destroy sort of the outside or the growing part of the tree. And then in order to compensate for that, the living tissue will sort of grow around that now dead part, those dead cells on the cambium there, the outside or the growing part of the tree. So that can result in a scar. So we use a scale from 1, which is an obvious avalanche signal or scar, to a 5, where the growth we know it's a growth disturbance, but we're sort of uncertain that it was an avalanche. It could be another exogenous factor like rockfall or landslide, or even a large animal coming by and rubbing themselves along the tree. So it can range. So that's why we have a scale. But you can see here the C1 impact scar and what that looks like in the image on the screen. And then another potential signal is what we call reaction wood. So imagine that tree is on the slope again, and an avalanche comes down, hits the uphill side of that tree, and it doesn't uproot it, but it hits it, and maybe there's a scar, but maybe not. But maybe it tilts the tree over. And so what the tree is now going to do, it's going to put sort of extra growth on the downhill side, because the tree wants to stand up straight. So it's going to put extra growth on the downhill side to allow that tree to stand up straight. And we call that reaction wood. So that the downhill side will now have sort of thicker, the ring will look thicker on the downhill side. And so, again, that's a pretty good signal. We rated that as a C2, so not quite as good as a C1, but we have successive years of reaction wood. So you can see from 1927 and 1933 as well. We have successive years of reaction wood, so the tree trying to right itself. So again, how do we know it's an avalanche year? So how do we distinguish between avalanche responses from noise in the tree ring? So again, first we sampled and we used mostly cross sections. And second, again, don't worry about the equations here, but we created an avalanche activity index. We basically applied a series of filters using thresholds. These thresholds are based on sample size and the number of growth disturbances per year within each avalanche path. And then finally, we placed more weight on the higher quality responses. So those C1 responses that you saw in that image prior, those are going to be weighted more heavily than a C2 and then a C3 and so on. So what did we find? We'll get to this Venn diagram here in a sec, but we ended up with 673 samples from 647 trees. Within those 673 samples, we identified over 2,100 growth disturbances. The mean age of our trees was 73 years, and we constructed an avalanche chronology, as I mentioned before, from 1867 to 2017. And this resulted in us being able to identify 30 large magnitude avalanche years across the region. So again, after we applied the sort of filtering stages, filtered out all the noise, we came up with 30 major large magnitude avalanche years throughout the region. So those 4 subregions combined. This little Venn diagram here, if we take those 4 subregions separately, and that's what the initials up top denote, the value in the center there, 1982, is the only year that was common between all 4 subregions. And then we had 5 other years that were common between at least 3 of the subregions. So what this shows us is basically that scale is really important, and that sampling across a large area requires pretty careful and strategic sampling. So for statistical analysis, we took some climate data, and this is looking at the climate and avalanche relationships. And we took our regional reconstructed avalanche chronology. So we, excuse me, looked at avalanche versus non-avalanche year, took a univariate analysis, and then we took those significant variables and threw those into a principal component analysis to sort of reduce collinearity. We then took the principal components and we used those as explanatory variables in a generalized linear autoaggressive moving average model. This sort of accounts for the problem that happens when we're trying to collect tree rings is that if you have an avalanche and it takes out a bunch of trees, then you don't have any trees there to pick up an avalanche that may occur next year. And so what this does is it allows us to actually sort of look back in time and use a moving average for avalanche activity through time, and sort of helps. It doesn't fully alleviate, but it helps constrain this limitation. And then we were able to take that and look at the Galarma model and use that to examine trends in the probability of large magnitude avalanches through time. One thing to note is that while our avalanche reconstruction was from 1867 to 2017, we only examined the large magnitude avalanches in the context of the climate data from 1950 to 2017, because a lot of those climate indices only went back to about 1950. So what did we find? Well, we found a slight but significant decrease in the probability of large magnitude avalanche years. So the chance that a year would be a large magnitude avalanche decreased from 1950 to 2017. This translates to roughly a 2% reduction in avalanche probability per decade. And this coincides with the trend of the panel B there of maximum snow depth decreasing over time. And maximum snow depth was the largest contributor variable to our first principal component. So basically, snow depth decreases, the probability of avalanche decreases as well. I'll explain a little bit more about this in a second, but I do want to show that the probability of avalanche year, so decreases again as the first principal component becomes more positive. So you can see that the probability drops when we have less snow and sort of high atmospheric pressure, nice sunny weather. And this explains about 40% of the variability. And then finally, though, our second principal component, which is driven mostly by sort of warmer winter temperatures, it was sort of moderately negatively correlated, but you can see that the probability is still greater when we have warmer temperatures. So what we can infer here is that, yes, the decrease in snowpack depth over time is the most influential driver in our avalanche probability, but that decrease is actually buffered by warming and spring precipitation. We also found that March precipitation was a significant predictor. So it is buffered by this warming and spring precipitation. And the implications here are our results suggest that large magnitude avalanches can occur during years of below average snowpack. So it's not just during big snow years, but the probability of a large magnitude avalanche year decreases through time as snowpack decreases. One of the things, or one of the reasons we hypothesize is that we're still going to get snow in the upper elevations. So avalanches can still initiate at these upper elevation starting zones. But as an avalanche moves down an elevation, and there's, of course, snowpack at lower elevations is most susceptible to warming. So if we have less snow at lower elevations, there's going to be a lot more surface roughness. So basically more vegetation sticking out and less material to entrain. So the run out extent of these large magnitude avalanches may be decreasing as well. We didn't look into that, but that's one of the reasons we suggest why we might see a decrease in probability as well due to snowpack decreases. So again, will temperature play an increasingly greater role? We still need to do more work on that in terms of will we see more wet snow avalanches, which I'll discuss in a bit. But we do know that studies like this will help us understand avalanche frequency in a changing climate, and this prepares us for large avalanche cycles in general. And then finally, dendrochronology it's useful for reconstructing these large magnitude avalanche occurrence throughout a region, and can help forecasting efforts and infrastructure planning. So let's move on to the remote sensing portion of some of the work we do. So we've been using drones to map avalanches across the landscape on mostly the slope or basin scale, because we're more interested in sort of both from an avalanche as a hazard, but also from snow as a water resource in specific basins, and how how snow lingers in certain terrain or not into the spring and summer. So we use drones and structure for motion photogrammetry to generate high resolution digital surface models, or DSMs. And we're talking about the centimeter scale here. So 2 centimeter resolution on some of these models with very, very low error. From here, we can determine the failure layer or the bed surface of each of these avalanches that we're able to map. Or in the case of avalanches in the upper left, these are the upper left image here with the boxes around them. Those are glide avalanches. And then to the right there is a digital surface model of that same exact scene, same exact day. So we're able to create these digital surface models, and the ones that fail at the ground, we're able to look at the snow depth on those. And determining the snow depth there, or even just the failure layer of avalanches that don't fail at the ground, helps us with the forecasting the timing of other avalanches in other locations that may occur later. So in those places that we can reach, on skis or foot or snowmobile, we're able to get there and measure those depths for comparison. So we created a digital surface model of snow depth change by comparing the snow surface elevation basically at different time steps, known as differencing. So the data collected in this way in these short intervals, such as before and after a storm or before and after a wind event, this allows us or gives us detailed snow depth information that's really critical for avalanche forecasting. And so in this work, in complex terrain, we collected data over the course of a winter on a weekly time step. And fortunately, we are also able to capture a large avalanche you can see in that top image there on the right. And that was about a half day after it occurred, so pretty recent after occurrence. And we were able to identify the weak layer and the slab depth from that digital surface model instead of getting in there and having to expose ourselves to the objective hazard on that slope, even after the avalanche. overall, we found that a single storm or melt event can dominate accumulation patterns for the season, depending on the magnitude of that storm event or melt event, and that the spatial variability of snow depth is greater in complex terrain than when compared to more uniform and sheltered meadows. We are currently working right now on processing these data on Yeti, the USGS HPC, and looking at basically optimal spatial variability of snow depth in complex terrain at these time steps. And so it's a huge amount of data that Zach Miller and our group is working on. And it'll be pretty cool because the resolution is so incredibly high that it'll be really cool to see what we get out of this for optimal spatial variability in this type of terrain. And this type of work informs where and when we should collect data for avalanche forecasting and again for water resources into the summer. So we also are looking at avalanche frequency and how that affects forests and vegetation. We implemented a novel approach using LiDAR and aerial imagery and a random forest model to classify imagery-based imagery observed vegetation within avalanche paths. And again, the avalanche path you see here on this image with the red outline is in John S. Stevens Canyon in southern Glacier Park. And you can see the railway there and how the bottom, the runout zone of the avalanche path, or the railway runs through that, and then that runout zone also extends over the Highway 2, US Highway 2 as well. So we used tree ring chronologies and observational records to basically come up with a spatially explicit avalanche return intervals for this path. Well, two paths in this area. Return intervals are, of course, just the number of years an avalanche reaches any given point on the landscape. And we did this again for two paths to test its efficacy. So let's see, there we go. We can see that in panel A here, the colors, of course, correspond to return periods. And so this is the one we were just looking at in that previous satellite image. But in this case, we have mapped the return periods. You can see that it has sort of two feeder zones or starting zones, and they, of course, converge into one runout zone. You can see the railway there, and that the red denotes roughly a 2.5 year return period. So that sort of looker's right starting zone is certainly a more frequent, or the avalanches run more frequently in that part of the avalanche path. And then you can see that the middle of the path, because it's an incised channel, the avalanche debris typically flows down the middle of the avalanche path. And then the sort of lighter blue on the very outside of that runout zone at the bottom by the north arrow is a 22-year return period. And so that's a much lower frequency event, much lower frequency return interval. And then the pink dots, of course, represent our tree rings in place. So you can see that in this case, we didn't just sample near the bottom of the avalanche path. We sampled up into sort of what we call the track, or the area where the avalanche runs down, not quite into the starting zones, but basically we wanted to capture, or we wanted to try and look at the tree rings where avalanches weren't necessarily large magnitude. So try and capture some of these smaller or more frequent avalanches. And then the panels on the right are just the vegetation that we were able to classify. So we used aerial imagery and LiDAR to classify this vegetation in these avalanche paths, and then within the return period zones within each path. And so we used an automated based on the random forest model. And it differed slightly between the avalanche paths, but the combination of both LiDAR and the spectral signature from aerial imagery provided the best accuracy, which is about 88 to 92% in classifying the vegetation within the complex avalanche terrain. And so we also just looked at LiDAR to basically see how useful LiDAR is, because you can imagine that instead of going through the work of doing the dendrochronology and the amount of time it takes, can we look at sort of low frequency return periods, let's say like 25 years or 50 years or 100 years using LiDAR, And LiDAR is definitely useful for that lower frequency event when we're looking at canopy height. But when we're looking at higher frequency return periods, it's basically anything sort of below 20 years, then LiDAR just doesn't really prove useful for discriminating the return periods there because it's based on, again, canopy height on that vegetation. All right, and finally, on the remote sensing portion, we just began a project evaluating the efficacy of using satellite imagery to create a regional chronology of avalanche disturbance across the landscape. So we're doing this for the entirety of Glacier National Park to start off, and we're using pattern recognition technique. This looks at changes in the vegetation within and around avalanche paths, so that this provides us a measure of avalanche frequency and then the associated landscape change at the decadal scale. So using long-term Landsat and other satellite imagery data sets like Landsat, we can analyze the spectral representations of previously mapped avalanche paths across the large region to quantify landscape change due to avalanche disturbance. The bottom there is using a tool called LandTrender to basically segment based on the spectral signature. So stay tuned for more on this. We're just starting this portion of the project. So I'll dive into the avalanche forecasting component and then wrap up with some of the wet snow avalanche work that we do as part of this avalanche forecasting work. So we, as I mentioned before, we have a collaboration with the National Park Service in Glacier National Park and avalanche forecasting. And we work with them every spring during the opening of the Going to the Sun Road. The Sun Road is 80 kilometers, of which 56 are closed every year, and mostly in the Alpine section. And 11 kilometers of actual roadway are impacted by avalanches. There are 37 total paths that you can see on the map on the right. And the colors denote basically just the length of roadway that the avalanches impact. So red being a greater amount, and then yellow being orange being the smallest. And for each day it's open, the Sun Road adds roughly 300 to almost 650,000 to the state economy. This is actually an old figure, so I imagine it's much more now, particularly since visitation in the park has gone up dramatically in the past few years. The median opening of the road is June 8th. So avalanches are a common threat to both people and infrastructure in Glacier Park. So this is an example in 1953. A wet snow avalanche killed 2 workers during spring opening operations. In 1964, a bulldozer operator triggered a wet slab avalanche that while clearing the road and was knocked off the road. Fortunately, he survived, but with pretty substantial injuries. And you can see the fracture line up there by the road. That fracture line, and it sort of extends sort of in a stepped fashion to the left of the image. And that, for a little scale, is it's about 10 to 15 feet in height from the snow surface to the bed surface there. So the public are allowed to bike and walk and recreate along the Going to the Sun Road after work hours. So once the road crew and associated personnel are off the road for the day or the weekend, they're allowed to recreate on the road. So in 2003, a cyclist was moving along the road and stopped for a little snack here at this spot and heard a really large rumble. She turned around and saw this. So an incredibly close call. She was, of course, just fine. But this is a large wet slab avalanche. You can see that it's pretty dirty, which means that it went to the ground or near the ground and entrained a lot of dirt and woody debris. And that was another close call. There have been more recent close calls with recreationalists along the Sun Road, and both in 2018 and again in 2021, just this past spring. There were cyclists that had traveled up the road and an avalanche came down, blocked the road like you can see in this image, and basically blocked them from getting back down. The debris was too steep for them to walk back across, particularly with bikes. And so they were stranded up top. So we helped assist with sort of forecasting while the road crew cleared the debris off of the road there. So the Park Service is reevaluating their interface with the public regarding avalanche hazard, and we're involved in those discussions with them to help consult with them. But for an internal forecast, which is what we provide, this is sort of what it looks like. Any employee of the park who's working on the road can access this. The map there on the left page denotes the avalanche rating on specific parts of the road. So some parts are actually would be rated differently depending on the amount of snow left, the potential for any sort of avalanche hazard, steepness, those sorts of things. And so we have a sort of an internal rating system that we use, 4-tiered or 4-scale system. And then we provide a bit of a discussion so that they can understand why things are rated the way they are. And then we of course provide the probability, the expected size of avalanches, and then the trend over 12 to 24 to 48 hours. And so this is an internal forecast. Again, we work with Park Service forecasters to do this work, but this is put out as a daily product. So part of the Avalanche Forecasting Partnership, as I mentioned, allows us to collect data related to wet snow avalanches, and this is becoming increasingly more important in the context of a warming climate. So one of the things we're looking at is characterizing the evolution of snowpack properties as the snowpack transitions from a cold, dry snowpack to a wet snowpack in the spring. The timing and duration of this transition, hopefully understanding that will help us understand the timing of these destructive wet slabs and glide avalanches. So this schematic shows how water moves through a cohesive slab here through flow fingers. And it could potentially pool at what we call a capillary barrier between two different layers. This happens when we have fine grains, what we're calling rounds in this case, over more coarse grain snow like depth core, which is a pretty common weak layer in continental snow climates. So if we get water pooling at that interface between the two, and it erodes the bond between the cohesive slab above and the weak layer below, then we could potentially get an avalanche. As I mentioned, they're destructive. You saw the pictures. They have a large impact on the spring opening operations on Sun Road each year. Another type of avalanche that impacts the road that we have spent some time studying are glide avalanches. And glide avalanches, so snow cover on a slope is always gliding downhill. So gravity is just going to slowly pull it downhill. So it slides down slope, but it slides at variable rates. Of course, some parts move down slope faster than others due to a variety of factors, including what's underneath the snow. So if it's a smooth rock slab, then things are going to move and glide downhill faster throughout the season. And the glide, remember, is a very slow process. It's not sort of this quick spontaneous, or not spontaneous, but this quick release of an avalanche that when you think of a snow avalanche, this is a very slow movement. But you get these variable glide rates, and then you can have a tensile crack that forms. We call it a glide crack. So that's sort of the frown face that you can see there. And the sort of prerequisites for a glide avalanche are we need basically water moving through the snowpack and moving along or pooling at the bottom of the snowpack and at the ground interface, which is typically at 0 degrees once the snowpack has become isothermal at 0 degrees. So same temperature throughout the whole snowpack. And again, minimal surface roughness. So smooth rock slabs are a pretty common area where we see these glide avalanches. Here's an example of a glide avalanche. They involve the entire snowpack, so they're often very destructive. So for a little reference here, the fracture line height in this image, where the avalanche released from the snowpack above, it averages about 15 feet, and it tops out at about 50 feet. Kind of can't see that, but it's up in the upper left corner of that fracture line there. So the time before, or the time between crack formation as you saw in the previous image, and in full snow depth release, can be highly variable. It can be, in fact, sometimes hours, not even just days, but hours, days to weeks. Often triggered by rain, snow melt, and even sometimes we've seen these avalanches release during cooling periods after an intense warming or rain event. Glide avalanches also tend to occur in the same location each year. We call these repeat offenders. So we map the repeat offenders that affect infrastructure and roadways. We developed an automated GIS model that identifies potential locations or allows us to identify potential locations for other glide avalanche release in other areas. We use time-lapse photography to pinpoint the timing of glide avalanches, and the timing, or pinpointing the timing, of course, is the real crux, as you all know. So looking at these images, we can ostensibly count the number of dark pixels versus the number of light pixels in the image, where that red box is an example. And so we track the number of light versus dark pixels in a sort of area of interest over time. This gives us a rate of glide to see if the glide rates are increasing during specific weather events or just prior to full depth release, like on hot sunny days, for example. So the camera we have takes an image every 15 minutes, allows us to identify avalanche release and glide rates on a really short time step. Of course, the limitation here is that when it's cloudy or dark, then we can't see it. But fortunately, in the spring, we have a lot of daylight up here in Northwest Montana, so that helps. But we have seen avalanches release. They weren't there in the last picture in the evening, and then they show up. The bed surface is visible the next morning. So that's one of the techniques that we use for glide avalanches as well. So that's all I've got. I want to thank Matt and everyone in the Landslide Hazards Program for the opportunity to present our work at NOROCK with a bit of a focus on our avalanche science. So thanks to all of you again for tuning in, and I'll take any questions that there might be.